Hello everyone, welcome back again to this online NPTEL course on structural geology. We are today in our lecture number 26 and we are learning this in this lecture Boudinage and Pinch-n-Swell structures, and this is the last lecture of this week. So, in this week we will cover a few topics very briefly. The first we will look at Boudinage in transverse sections. We have learned a few terminologies in the previous lecture, but in this lecture we will mostly look at their processes, that how we actually do generate different types of cross sections in the transverse sections. And then we will look at a very special topic, which is aspect ratio of Boudins. Then we will see the foliation Boudinage. We learnt about it while we were classifying this. We will talk a little bit more on this because it demands special attention. Then we will see that how strain ellipsoids, the bulk strain ellipsoids is related with the Boudinage processes. So, which direction, what kind of structures or Boudinage we can form. Then we will see the relationship with folds with respect to Boudinage, and then finally we will conclude this lecture with Boudinage under superposed deformation. So, a lot of topics, but they are very small and we will cover it one after another. So, yeah, so you have learnt about it in the transverse section. We figured it out that the Boudins they may have varied shapes, and this could be rectangular, barrel shaped, lenticular, fish head and rhombic shapes. Now, these dissimilar shapes give us some information concerning the competence contrast between a Boudinage layer and its host rock, and at the same time it tells us the pre-Boudinage and post-Boudinage plastic deformation in particular. So, what we see here, a series of illustrations are here. You see this is rectangular Boudins, then barrel shaped Boudins, then lenticular Boudins, and then fish head Boudins and rhombic Boudins. Now, these are not necessarily the product during the Boudinage. So, rectangular Boudins, yes, when you just initiate the Boudinage processes, then it is possible that you form the geometry or the structure like this. But with continued deformation, we actually arrive somewhere here. The rhombic Boudins are somehow different. We will not look at it in detail, but if you are interested, you may have a look of a paper by Professor Mandal in 2001. So, that describe, but we mostly restrict ourselves towards the up to the fish head Boudins. Now, the presence of rectangular Boudins with edges at right angle to the general layering, this is what we see here. It simply indicates the fact that throughout the course of development of Boudinage, the layer, this layer which is undergoing Boudinage processes behaved in a brittle manner. Now, at the corners of these Boudins, there is relatively high shear stress which tends to deform the Boudins. Now, this is exactly what happens at the post Boudinage processes. What we see here, that this was initially, probably in this illustration, this was initially a rectangular Boudinage, but with continued deformation it is possible, this is the way the Boudins do form, you have shear stress at the extensional faces or exterior faces. So, the preservation of the sharp right angles corners of rectangular Boudins therefore indicates that the competence contrast between the Boudins and the host rock is very large. So, if the competence contrast is extremely large, then you would see this kind of rectangular Boudinage, but if not, then you will see features like this, which we will be discussing soon. So, barrel shaped Boudins, which is this one, this is a very typical process and this evolves with the Boudinage processes. So, the barrel shaped Boudins with straight edges are produced with some amount of necking, which is followed by extensional fracture at the neck joints, mostly at these places. So, this shape that which we see here, this barrel shaped Boudins, these actually can be further modified by post Boudinage plastic deformation. Now, this is illustrated here. We will see one after another that how these do happen. Now, the Boudins are more competent than the host rock, this is what we have learnt. So, they deform more slowly than the surroundings. So, the matrix outside deforms faster than this. Okay. And if that happens, then you develop a shear strain at the longer edges of the Boudins as it is represented here. So, you see that you have a shear strain, not only that, the gradient of the shear strains are there as well. So, at the middle the shear strain is, the magnitude of the shear strain is less, and while we are travelling towards the edge of the Boudin or the corner of the Boudin, the magnitude of the shear strain continuously increased. And you also see that the sense of shear is opposite. If you make this Boudin a symmetric line, which is this one. So, since the sense of the shear is opposite in the two halves of the Boudin, the shear is associated with an effective lengthening of that part of the Boudin with or which is close to the contact. So, these materials actually try to drag it, and you always remember that in this case the competence contrast is not as hard as you can expect for the rectangular Boudinage. So, the shear strain and the associated lengthening decreases towards the mid level as it is here of the Boudinage layer. Now, we can see that as a result the lateral walls of the Boudins curve inward. This is exactly what is happening here. So, they try to curve inward and also this one. So, the zone of curving also undergoes a larger layer normal compression, so that the barrel like shapes is exaggerated. This is exactly what we see here. Now, when a very large amount of such post Boudinage plastic deformation leads to the formation of fish head Boudinage, this is exactly what we see here. So, here we had barrel shaped, and with progressive deformation during the post Boudinage plastic deformation we arrive at fish Boudinage process. Now, this can actually further continue to develop something which is exactly the shape of lenticular Boudinage, which we have learnt in the last lecture. And this is also evident from experimental deformation, and these experiments generally show that with soft models the decreasing competence contrast between a layer and its embedding medium, extension fracture is produced, as we have learned, by a greater layer parallel homogeneous elongation as well as a greater localized deformation by necking. Now, if the competence contrast is small, the necking continues as we see here till the pinched zones taper off and lenticular Boudins are separated without the formation of a clearly defined layer normal extension feature. So, this has been noted by Hans Ramberg, and this is a classic paper of 1995. As you can see here, the first one, this one is a classic lenticular Boudin. So, there it was like this is the shape of this Boudin. Okay. So, this is some sort of a pinch-n-swell structure, but the pinches are got teared off. But here if you look clearly, that the shape of the Boudin is something like that. So, it was initially a barrel shaped Boudinage, then it turned into fish mouth Boudinage, and now its morphology is very similar to that of a lenticular Boudinage. So, it is a continued process where you actually can figure out that initially you form a barrel, then slowly it tapers inward and then it forms fish mouth, and with further progressive deformation you can arrive at a shape of lenticular Boudinage or lenticular Boudins. Now, let us talk about the aspect ratio of the Boudins, which is the next topic we will cover. So, here I have given two drawings for you. What we see here, that if you imagine that this layer, this layer, this layer, this layer, they have very similar properties, and also these two orange layers. Now, what we also see here in this illustration, that this layer is thicker than this layer. So, this is the competent layer, this is as well, compared to the surrounding gray layers. Now, if there is layer normal compression of very similar magnitude, similar deformation rate and so on, then you can ask yourself a question, or I would like to ask you the question, what is the expectation after a finite time of deformation and the boudinaging is going on, then where I would form maximum number of boudins, in this case or in this case. You can think of this and you can write me back your answers, but this is a very interesting problem, and we will see with time that how we can go ahead with that, and we can figure out that what would be the aspect ratio of the boudins. But before we jump into this topic, let us have a very common understanding of this. So, general observations, as you can see here from this illustration, it is from Marcos et al. 2012, that large boudins are generally from thicker layers, and small boudins, they do originate from relatively thinner layers. So, this is the plot boudin thickness versus boudin width. They more or less follow a linear relationship, as you can see here from a lot of data that Fernando collected, and he also conducted analog experiments. We have seen this image in the last lecture, but what we see here, that this is thicker layer and this is much thinner layer, and with this thicker layer we have large boudins, and with the thinner layer slowly we are increasing the number of boudins. Now, you can also see one more very important thing, we will see this also in the illustration, that the gap between these two is smaller than this gap. This indicates that we had the first fracture here, then this one and so on, and this is how it proceeds. So, generally what we can figure out, that the aspect ratio of boudins are generally measured in sections perpendicular to a boudin axis. For unidirectional boudinage, the aspect ratio is the ratio of width versus the thickness of the boudins. And you can consider the two dimensional boudinage, then we have also to measure the length to thickness ratio. The width to thickness ratio of boudins interestingly may vary within a wide range. However, in most areas there is a general tendency of thicker beds to form boudins of larger widths. Now, what we see here, that the general range of width of thicknesses which have been reported from different field studies, that few studies reported that it is generally from 2 to 4, few made it really large 2 to 20, and then some made it really narrow 1.4 to 3.3 and so on, and these are from different studies. So, the theory of boudinage, if we can consider, predicts that in any one of the competent bed, boudins with a restricted range of aspect ratios should be more frequent than others. Now, you can consider a simple situation. Assume that a brittle layer is sandwiched between two ductile layers and is subjected to a layer normal compression. This is the case you can consider. We have seen this illustration before. Okay. Now, we have understood this before, that when the stress exceeds the strength of this rock, it flows and then it forms a fracture in the middle, and then the boudinaging process starts. So, in a way we can say that when the stress exceeds the strength, an extension fracture develops perpendicular to the layering, and the layer is thus broken into two segments, which is this case. So, this is one segment and this is the second half of that segment. Now, if you continue the deformation, that means if you continue the layer normal compression and it continues flowing laterally, the separation between the two pieces increases. So, this is exactly what is increasing, and very interestingly that you have the fresh midpoint fractures from each of these pieces. So, you are having these new fractures, whether this is the first one and then you arrive at the new fractures. Now, the stress within a competent fragment increases with increasing width, that means that is the length at a right angle to the Boudin axis, and decreases with increasing thickness. This means, very interestingly, that it becomes increasingly difficult for a bed or for a layer, competent layer, to fracture when the Boudin width become shorter, right. And this is very easy, because if we have a shorter Boudin, the length of the Boudin is less, then instead of fracturing it would try to produce, if the ductility of the layer is pretty high, but still more than these two layers, then it can form the barrel shape, fish mouth shape, and so on. So, this is the reason why it is expected that the Boudins of a bed would show a small range of width to thickness ratios. Now, then the question comes, what would be the final aspect ratio? The final aspect ratio, which is obtained after these processes, this midpoint fracturing, is a function on its initial length, and this becomes clear if we consider, you can think of an example, and you can imagine that the critical aspect ratio, for example, you can think of that would be the 2. Now, what is critical aspect ratio here? That there is always a critical aspect ratio below which further midpoint fracturing is not possible. That means the Boudinage processes for that particular layer is finished for this particular deformation. Now, you can think of that if we start from a layer segment of aspect ratio 20, where you can consider that the critical aspect ratio for that particular layer is 2, then by successive midpoint fracturing you can arrive at a value of 2.5. This is simple arithmetic. Now, since this is larger than your critical aspect ratio or AR, the segment will suffer further extension fracture to yield stable Boudins with aspect ratio, in that case it would be 1.25. Now, if instead you can consider that instead of 20, if the starting layer segment has an aspect ratio 30, we get the final aspect ratio to 1.875 of a stable Boudins. So, depending upon the initial length of the layer segments in a transverse section, the final Boudin aspect ratio may range between the original critical aspect ratio, which is AR, to AR by 2 as it is written here. Now, in the nature, because this is some sort of geometric aspects that we are considering here, but in nature the range is likely to be modified by a lot of other factors, such as you can consider the occurrence of flows in the competent bed, variation of strength and microstructure in different parts of this bed, some defects or some initial fractures within all these layers and so on. So, these also control the aspect ratio of the Boudins, but in general if everything is homogeneous, then you expect the aspect ratio of the Boudin between the critical aspect ratio and half of it. Let us move to the next topic, which is the foliation boudinage. Now, we have learned about it, this foliation boudinage. If you remember the classification, we also considered that the boudinage is possible in multilayers and also in foliations. Now, in the somewhat similar way of single layer boudinage processes, the multilayers or foliations can get densely packed and generate boudinage structures with a thickness that is considerably greater than that of individual layers or lamina, and these are known as foliation boudinage. Now, what do we mean by this? So, for simple single layer boudinage processes, we understood that that requires a competence contrast between the boudinage layer and the layers outside. But when you have a foliation like this or multi-layers like this, there is apparently no competence contrast. It is almost a continuous layer with very high and strong anisotropy. But what is interesting in this kind of situation, that you are applying still a flow along the layers, and therefore, you can also imagine that there is a layer normal compression. Now, because the anisotropy is very high and layers are very thin, you can expect the fact that a group of layers can fracture at one point of time or one after another. When that happens, then you arrive at a situation where everything flows like this outside, and these layers are fractured and they appear like this. The layers on the other side are like this, and so on. So, now you see that this actually is representing your like a shape of Boudins, but apparently these segments, this segment, this segment or this segment, they do not have any competence contrast with respect to the surrounding layers. So, this is very interesting process, and we see this in nature, people do research on it, and here is an example of the foliation boudinage. Now, foliation boudinage is common in well foliated rocks. The foliation simply tears, as I have explained here, they just break in little pieces, which allows for more extension, and foliation boudinage is therefore a type of structure that develops at a relatively late stage of deformation, because you need this strong anisotropy, and it generally forms after the foliation is extremely strong and is well developed. Now, foliation boudinage, as we have classified, can be symmetric or asymmetric. So, a symmetric foliation boudinage is where you do not have any you have only separation by tensile fractures. The separated zones or the neck zones, as we can see here, they do not undergo any shear deformation. So, it is only separation by tensile fractures, and if that happens, then this is a symmetric foliation boudinage, as you can see here. So, you see that these layers, this packet of layers here, they got boudinaged, and this is the tensile fracture that it has developed, right. So, there is no apparent slip along this, or no visible slip between this segment and this segment and this segment, and therefore, this is a symmetric type of foliation boudinage. However, asymmetric foliation boudins are separated by brittle shear fractures or by ductile shear bands, showing a relative displacement along the fracture or bands. As you can see here, that it had a tensile fracture at one point of time, but after that it has a sense of displacement along the fracture zone, and this is an excellent example, as you can see here. So, we can imagine that this is a packet, then this is another packet defining the Boudin, this is another packet which is defining the Boudin, and this is another packet which is defining a Boudin, and you can clearly see that it got a relative displacement along the neck zone or fracture zone of the Boudins, and therefore, this is asymmetric foliation boudinage. Now, we will switch to the next topic, that how these boudinages are related, or Boudins are related with the strain ellipsoid. Now, the boudinage is a deformation induced process. This is quite obvious, we have learnt it. So, the structure must correspond to the strain ellipsoid either regionally or locally. The transverse section, where we generally see the Boudins in a row, can be approximated to the XZ plane of the strain ellipsoid. However, the y direction is also important for kinematic analysis, as it is not necessarily is always under plane strain, and we will see this very soon. Now, depending on the relative magnitudes of the three principal axes of strains, the 3D disposition of an entire layer undergoing boudinage may display variety of structures, and this is exactly what we are going to see in the next slide. And I will request you to recall the strain lecture or go back to the strain lecture, because we will be seeing now plane strain, constrictional strain, flattening type of strains and so on, and then we will see how we form the boudinage or some other related structures along with this kind of various strain ellipsoids. So, let us have a look. So, what we see here in this slide, this first image, it looks like a gift box, but it is not. So, this is you can consider unit cube, and this brown, then blue and this green layers are competent layers which are aligned perpendicular to x, y and z axis. So, for example, this blue layer is aligned perpendicular to the x axis, the brown layer is perpendicular to the z axis, and the green layer is perpendicular to the y axis. Now, you can also ask this question, do you see this kind of features in geology, in structures where you have three layers cross cutting each other? The answer is yes. You can consider one is your primary bedding plane, and then other two could be two different dikes that have intruded at different stages of time, and then the entire packet is undergoing deformation. So, this is not a problem, therefore, we will see this, that yes, this is a possibility. Now, first we will take over this problem of uniform flattening. Uniform flattening, if you remember that your z axis has to be shortened and y and x axis should move or should flow equally. So, the condition is x equal to y, which is greater than 1, and z is less than 1. This is the condition. Now, if that happens, then this brown layer, because it is flowing in perpendicular to the z section, therefore, the brown layer would get boudinaged along the x direction, also along the y direction, and therefore, this layer, if I consider this brown layer here, this one exactly, then it would produce two sets of boudinage, and this is known as, we have learnt it, chocolate tablet boudinage. Okay. If that does not happen, if the strain is like a plane strain, that means your y axis is constant, there is no deformation along the y axis, then this brown layer, which is the horizontal layer perpendicular to the z, then the flow is only along the x direction and shortening along z direction. So, this brown layer would actually experience a layer normal compression and layer parallel extension. Therefore, we would have a boudinage of shape like this. And if we have uniform constriction, which is shown here, that means this brown layer is very interestingly would flow in x direction. So, no problem that it is forming boudinage along the x direction, but because it is uniform constriction, so it is getting compressed along y direction. So, along y direction, because it is getting compressed, it would produce some compressional structures like fold. Also, the green layers would produce a compressional structure if you viewed perpendicular to the x section, and the blue layers also produce on both sections, because this is something that we are looking at, that the layer is undergoing compression in all directions. So, this is how you have the chocolate tablet boudinage, simple one layer single boudinage or single boudinage as you see here, and then boudinage with folding. You can form this in a single deformation. We will see soon that boudinage in superposed deformation, but the message I would like to give you with this slide is that if you see a chocolate tablet boudinage, or if you see a boudinage in one section in another section, the same layer is folded, that not necessarily indicate that it is a result of superposed deformation. So, when you conclude your observations, it is very important that you look at some other sections or you observe things in a better way to arrive at a conclusion that whether these are the products of superposed deformation or from a single phase deformation. And speaking of which, we will come to the boudinage, which are related to the folds, because in folds it is very interesting, because a layer at one point of time undergoes compression and then it can go extension at one point of time. So, at the advanced stage, and then it can again come to the compressional field and so on, because it is very complex with respect to the local orientations of the strain ellipsoids. We have understood it in the fold lecture. So, generally in most of the cases the majority observations that people have seen, that Boudin axes are roughly parallel or perpendicular to the fold axis. But that is not the thumb rule. The Boudin axis or the length of Boudins need not to be either parallel or perpendicular to the fold axis. The Boudin axis may be parallel, perpendicular, or even oblique to the fold axis. Now, how to conceive this idea? Let's have a look on this with some simple drawings. We will see this in the form of illustrations, but let us imagine the fact that we have a layer, and then we are applying layer parallel compression. So, when we do that, then this is undergoing, the entire layer is undergoing, at least in this section, compression. So, the layer would produce a gentle fold. Isn't it? So, what is the orientation of the principal axis of strains in this case? Now, this must be your z direction, isn't it, because this is the shortening direction. So, this is your z. Okay. If that happens, then it is extending in this direction, okay, because this would be your long axis. So, we can consider for the time being this is x, that the principal extension direction, and we can assume that along this side there is no strain or plane strain condition. So, this can be your y. Now, with further deformation, if we assume it to the next stage, then the fold would produce a tighter fold, and then we will see very nicely if the orientations are same. This is your z, this is your y, and this is your x, that these limbs of these folds are slowly orienting themselves along the principal extension direction. So, therefore, this layer, if I consider this particular segment here or this segment here, is actually suffering or slowly undergoing a deformation, which is extension along the layers. However, the bulk strain ellipsoid is still the same direction the way we started. If that happens, then essentially these layers with further rotation, they would form boudinage like this. and so on. So, you see that under compression the global strain ellipsoid is under compression, but in this particular case, as you see here, with the continued deformation we are forming Boudinage structure which is associated with the fold in a single deformation. So, if we try to get it, that we have just learned that not necessarily it has to be in this case. Actually, in this case we have seen that this is the fold axis, this is parallel to the fold axis. However, if the compression is oblique to the layers, then you can actually form, let me wipe this one out because I do not have any more space. You can actually form Boudinage which can be oriented oblique to the fold axis. I am just giving you a rough idea. Now, we will learn about these processes soon in a different way, but the Boudin axis or the length of the Boudins need not to be either parallel or perpendicular to the fold axis. So, this is what is important, and the lengths of the Boudins can be also oblique to the axis of the folds, and such oblique Boudins, as we see here, that these are oblique Boudin axes are oblique to the fold, and these oblique Boudins may develop if the bed is oriented oblique to the principal axis of stresses. Now, the geometrical relation of Boudinage structures with folds should never be taken for granted, especially in rocks which are known to have undergone repeated deformations. This is something, as I told also when you look at the Boudinage and try to correlate with the strain ellipsoid, the same warning or same measures must be considered when you try to correlate the Boudinage processes with the fold. So, this is because the occurrence of Boudinage structure in a transverse section of a fold does not necessarily imply that the Boudin axis is parallel to the fold axis. The reason for emphasizing this obvious point that I am trying to convey you repeatedly, that the parallelism of Boudin axis and the fold axis has so often been emphasized that you or the students tend to make this assumption when they observe Boudinage structures on a fold profile, and they consider that this is either parallel or perpendicular to the fold axis, and this may not be always true. However, it is true that Boudin axis and fold axis are often approximately parallel, but in making this assumption without actual observation or measurement, there is a possibility that we are losing a vital piece of information in the reconstruction of the history of the superposed deformation. So, in areas of superposed deformation, the earlier Boudin axis may be oblique to the later fold axis. So, the Boudin orientation may got completely modified, and since the plan view of the Boudinage is very rare to see in the field, so such evidences, unless a careful search is made, is likely to be overlooked. Now, you can also think of the pinch-and-swell structures and extension fractures Boudinage, in which Boudin axis parallel to the fold axis. They cannot form at the initial stage of the folding processes. As you can see here, that when the fold is pretty open, we do not have any possibility of the Boudin. The Boudins may form, or they generally form at a later stage of folding when the limbs of the folds have entered in the extensional field. As we have seen, I have wiped out the drawing, but you can remember this drawing. You can go back with the slider and see the back slides, but here you see that this was your compression direction, and this layer in particular was actually suffering a layer normal compression. So, this occurrence of small extension fracture Boudinage, that this is here, that these are the extensional fracture Boudinage and so on, or you can have also pinch-and-swell structures here in a very similar mechanism. At the broad hinge zone, you do not see that. So, if you see Boudinage in the hinge zone, there must be a second stage of deformation. So, if you see Boudinage like this, there must be a second stage of deformation, but otherwise in a single stage of deformation your hinge is generally unaffected. We will see this, that where we have some Boudinage where the hinge is affected, and in some places where hinge is not affected. Now, if there is an extension parallel to the fold axis, then the Boudinage may develop even at an early stage when the amplitude of the fold is small, and this is something can happen when you have extension along the y direction. In that case, you can develop Boudinage along this direction, but this is again possible, but not very much seen in the field. So, thus among extension fracture Boudinage structures which have grown during flexure or buckle folding, those which have their axis parallel to the fold axis must have been initiated when the folds were fairly tight. On the other hand, the Boudins which are perpendicular to the fold axis could have been initiated either at an early stage or at a very late stage of the folding. Now, we will see some illustrations in the next slide. As you can see here, we have been drawing this, but this is a better drawing. What we see here, that this is an open fold, nothing has happened. Then this is your extension direction x, then y and z is the compression direction, fold is forming in this way. So, in such a situation lambda 1, that is principal stretch, is 1, lambda 2 there is no movement along the y direction. So, this is 1, and lambda 3 is less than 1 because this is the compression direction. Now, with progressive deformation, as you can see here, that this layer along the lambda 1 is getting Boudinaged, and if at later stage the lateral extension or it gets extended along the fold axis like this. So, y takes over, that means lambda 1 is also 1, much greater than 1, and at the same time lambda 2. So, this is a kind of constrictional deformation. Okay. Then you form the Boudinage in this direction and also in this direction, either simultaneously or one after another, and this is again a chocolate tablet Boudinage associated with folds, and I have a very nice example for you. Now, what do you see here? This is the form surface of a fold, this surface. This is the form surface of a fold, and you see that this is characterized by one set of fractures and then another set of fractures like this, almost orthogonal to that. Therefore, it produced the chocolate tablet Boudinage. And if you are not convinced that this is a fold, I would like to request you to see this side. You see that this is going like this and coming back like this. The fold axis or hinge zone is actually exposed here. So, it is going like this. Okay. So, this is how it happened. So, this could be your x and the or y, and this could be your x or y, and of course, the perpendicular direction, the way the person is looking at the direction the person is looking at here is the direction of the z along which the fold has formed or along which the bulk compression came to generate the fold. Now, let us talk about the Boudinage and superposed deformation. Now, what we see in this image, that you see this is a fold, but it got Boudinaged here, then it rotated, it got some pinch, then it got some swelling, and it has several fractures here, and these indicate that these were once a part of Boudinage. So, what I would like to emphasize here, that you can form Boudinage during folding processes, and then you have a layer undergone boudinaging process, and then the entire layer can be folded. So, these two processes are essentially different, and this is one example, and let us have a look to the other example. What we see here, that this is a fold, right. I mean, if I draw it thoroughly, it is a fold going like this, antiform, synform and so on. But we see here that this got a break. So, this was one single Boudin, then this is another Boudin. And you see it is off here. So, it was once upon a time something like that, a very long aspect ratio Boudins, and then it got some rare parallel compression and then eventually produced a shape like this. What you see in this other image, this is from the book of Professor Shubir Ghosh, you see that the hinge zone of this fold is boudinaged. So, as I have told you that if you see that Boudins at the hinge zone, that means that it records essentially the second stage of deformation, or this is a product of superposed deformation. So, the folding of a boudinaged layer in certain instances can be easily distinguished, as you can figure out, that from boudinaged structure which are initiated during folding. Thus, when extension fracture boudinage structures occur on the transverse profile of a gentle fold wave with the layering in both the hinge and the limbs in the compressional field, we can conclude convincingly that the boudinaged layers have been subsequently folded. We can arrive at the same conclusion when small Boudins are situated at the broad hinge, what we see here in this illustration. And in addition, the shortening of a boudinage layer also produce a variety of characteristic patterns, and we will see this in the next slide. But before that, let us have a look that how do we understand that experiments on folding of boudinage layers generally show that unlike folding, boudinage is not recoverable, that you make a fold and then you can unfold it. So, you are compressing something, so you make a fold and then you can unfold it, because it is a continuous layer. But if it is a boudinaged layer, then it is a segment of several blocks. So, once you fold it, then it is very difficult to unfold it, because these individual blocks also deform their own way. We will see this in the next slide. But during layer parallel shortening of a boudinaged layer, the nature of deformation of the layer is mostly controlled by one, the competence of the Boudins relative to the host rock, and the width to thickness ratio of the Boudins. So, these are the main ways, or these two are the main reasons that you can think of. And then we have a series of structures that you can produce when you have layer parallel compression in boudinaged layers. So, here are some examples. These are experimentally derived and also observed in the field. So, one is herringbone pattern of rigid Boudins, then tiled up long rigid Boudins, and then folding and tilting of flexible Boudins, and folding of tilting Boudins into half waves. So, how do they form? Short or medium sized very stiff Boudins can only undergo body rotation. So, these are very stiff Boudins, and it can go only the body rotation. So, they just rotate with the layer parallel compression, and these are known as herringbone pattern. And if these stiff Boudins have large width to thickness ratio, as we see here, and they are also very stiff, then they may produce a structure like this, which is known as tile like piling of one Boudin over another. Then the flexible Boudins, which we see here, that means the competence contrast between this and this is not that significant. they are folded, and if the width to thickness ratio is not large, then the individual Boudins are folded into half waves like you see here or here or here and so on, and the neighboring folds often closing in the same sense. So, you see that this is an antiform and the second one is also the antiform. So, these are the different structures that researchers have produced by experiments, and they figured out that this is how you can produce different kind of structures when you apply layer parallel compression in producing folds when you have Boudinage layers in it. So, with this I conclude this lecture and also the lectures of this week, and we will see some other features in the next class, and in the next week we mostly would focus on a new topic, and which will be mostly concerned the brittle deformation of rocks, and this would be fractures, joints and faults. So, thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. See you in the next lecture.